Okay, so this is in the Pines on page 277, chapter 12, um, part 2 of the Mor Nevuchim. Thank you for joining us tonight. Um, Rambam is in this uh, look. He's aiming us. He's bringing us towards his big kind of debate or discussion with Aristotle, in which Aristotle is of the opinion that the world uh, always is and always has been. That there is a prime mover that makes everything move and go, right? But but uh, but that it's always been this way. There was never a moment of creation and never an act of creation. And an essential component of religion is the belief that there's a creation, because if there's a moment of creation, then there's an actual creator. If God is just the prime mover that makes everything go, then he's not really a creator. So that's the the key area where Maimonides disagrees with Aristotle. Incidentally, if case I don't know if any of you know that this idea of the prime mover, which is a philosophical idea, um, what's the discovery that disproved Aristotle's idea of the prime mover? What's the discovery in physics? It goes to Isaac Newton that disproved Aristotle. Anybody know what principle in physics disproves all of the Rama many times keeps on talking about something is moving something. So if no one knows, I'll tell you. But
Gravity?
what was that?
Gravity?
A good try, but no. Um, what principle did everyone thinks Isaac Newton? They think gravity. So I'm not surprised you said that. It's the concept of inertia, right? That an object that's moving will continue moving until something stops it, right? So, and that's a basic principle of Newtonian physics. And once the idea of inertia, they didn't understand inertia because if they threw a ball or an apple through the air, eventually it would stop, right? Because the way they understood it then was the force that made that apple fly through the sky or ball or whatever only had a certain amount of force so that it stopped, right? Without understanding the idea of the friction was stopping it. But had you thrown a ball, had there been no friction and no gravity and no other forces acting on that ball, it would just keep on flying forever, right? But that's an idea that Aristotelian physics didn't comprehend. It's obvious to us because we learned Newtonian physics in elementary school. But anyway, that was just a side gig, a little bit in the history of physics. But that's what basically sunk the whole Aristotelian physics idea. So if you think about it, the whole philosophical proofs that I mean, I personally was exposed to that philosophical proof, which basically derives from Aristotle, um, of some sort of prime mover, was based on this idea that something has to be making it all move. But once you accept what Aristotle claimed, that the world has always been this way, then you don't need a prime mover anymore because of the concept of inertia. So that entire medieval, you find it in the Jewish farm, you find it in like books like Rambam, you find it in Chovos Halavavos, the duties of the heart by Rabbeinu Bachya Ibn Pakuda, who also writes about it. You find it in many other places, but that entire enterprise fell apart when Newton came along. Not the only idea which we find permeating the religious writings over the centuries, that science came along and just popped the bubble and the whole thing fell apart. Anyway, that was just a little tangent. But here let's go on. He's building towards that, and in this chapter, um, let's see. We're going to get a little bit closer to that step. So it is clear that everything produced in time has of necessity an efficient cause that causes it to be produced after having not been existent, right? So that what Rambam is saying is that anything that happens, right, something must bring it about, right? If there's a bunch of mud and then it turns into a brick and then the bricks pile up and become a house, right? Something took the mud and made it into a house, right? So the proximate agent must be either a body or not a body. Now, that thing that made it must either a person did it or some other force, something turned that pile of mud into a house. A body, however, does not act through being a body. Rather, does it accomplish a particular act through being a particular body. I mean through its form. I shall speak about this in what shall come after. So that what he just said is a little confusing, and he admits that, and he says he's going to get back to explaining it. But just to understand, when when he says this, like when if a person takes mud and makes it into a house, that person is a body making the mud into a house, right? If it's not that, let's say a person becoming a person, right, or some other thing. It's, remember we talked about the Homer and the Tsura, which is the form and the substance, right? There is something that gives the mud the form of mud. This is the way Aristotle looked at it. It's called the idea of hylomorphism, right? That every single thing it's made of a certain substance, but then there is a force which they called the tsura. That's the Hebrew term. The English term is the form that gives that substance the form that it has. All right, so this is all, again, Aristotelian physics, and this is what Rambam is referring to. This, and I promise that I'll do my best, like I did in the last lecture, and I've done in many previous lectures, to try to make comparisons and say, if Rambam says this using the physics and philosophy of his day, how would that make sense to us? Like, how could this be in any way, shape, or form useful to us now that this physics is completely outdated? So I will do that. But first, let's understand what Rambam is going to say. So this proximate agent, which produces in time the thing that is produced in time, may itself also be produced in time. So let's say you have a person that makes the mud into a house. That person must have been made at some point. This, however, cannot go on to infinity. And that person was made by another person who was made by another person who was made by blah, 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 blah. But at some point, there had to have been a beginning. It's the old what came first, chicken or the egg business. At some point, there had to have been a start. And this is the principle that Rambam laid out for us at the end of part 1, right? It can't go all the way back. It can't be, as the joke goes, turtles all the way down. There must be somebody holding up the pile of the turtles at the bottom, right? For of necessity, there is no doubt for us that if there is a thing produced in time, we finally must come to something eternal and not produced in time that has caused that thing to be produced in time. Right? It makes sense to say, right, there has to be something that started it all, something that's eternal, something that didn't have to have a beginning because it was always there, and that thing started it all and made it begin. So accordingly, the question remains why it has produced the thing at one particular moment and not before, as it itself was existing before. Whatever that eternal thing is, we know, of course, what Rambam is referring to, that eternal thing which we would refer to usually as God, right? Why did it decide, let's say Big Bang was 15 billion years ago. Why did it decide to do it 15 billion years ago and not 16 billion years ago or 13 billion years ago or yesterday or 5 minutes ago? Who knows, right? There has to be, now of necessity, there can be no doubt that the impossibility that the act produced in time could come about before it was produced is due either to the absence of a certain relation between the agent and the object of the action, right? So in other words, if you ask me, right, let's say I'm a builder and I know how to make bricks out of mud and I know how to build houses out of a pile of mud, right? So it could be that the reason why I decided to build the house on Tuesday was because on Monday I didn't have the mud yet, or the mud was in Alabama and I was in New York, so I wasn't there, right? So I couldn't build the house, right? So, or to the absence of the requisite verb, or it could be I didn't build the house because the mud wasn't muddy enough, right? There was something about the matter that I couldn't build a house yet. If the agent, right, or the tsura, which is this form that we don't really speak about today in physics, but remember the idea of hylomorphism, the idea of homer and tsura, of substance and form, that the matter wasn't yet ready to accept the form, right? If the agent is not a body, right? All these preliminary remarks, the reason why I'm saying all this, are in accordance with what in natural speculation is established as obligatory doctrine. It has to be this way, without any attention being given at present to the question of the eternity world of it being produced in time. But that is not the subject of the present chapter. I'm saying all this, right, because I'm laying out these facts, right? I'm going to get to my argument of whether or not the world is eternal or not, which is the crucial argument between Rambam and Aristotle, which we're going to get to in the not too distant future. He's driving there. It has been made clear in natural science that every body that acts in some manner upon another body does this only through encountering it, or through encountering something that encounters it, if this agent acts through intermediaries. So let's say, if I make a house out of mud, I need to be near the mud in order to make it happen. Or I hire somebody who knows how to make a house out of mud, and he goes and gets the mud and makes a house. For instance, if this particular body, which has present grown hot, right? Like, let's say you have a something which is hot. It was heated either because a body of fire encountered it, either it's hot because it was near a fire, or because fire heated air and the air heated it, right? So you didn't necessarily put the thing in the fire, but it was close enough to the fire that the fire heated the air and the air heated it. Even a magnet exerts an attraction upon iron at a distance through a force, right? Which spreads out through the air, which encounters the iron. Right? He's understanding a magnet as acting just as heat travels through the air. Whatever force of magnetism it is going through the air. For this reason, this particular fire does not exert an attraction at every distance, but only at a distance in which the air and the thing heated undergoes a change to the instrumentality of the force of the fire. Okay. If, however, the air heated by that fire stops short, right? And does not reach a candle, the latter is not melted by the heat, right? This is the case with regard to what attracts. Now, something that was not hot and then grew hot must necessarily be provided with the cause that made it be heated. I'm paraphrasing a few times, but I think you can still follow in there. I'm just modernizing a little bit some of this language. This might be either a fire produced in time or one that had been at a certain distance from that particular object, right? So if anything was never hot and then it became hot, or something must have made that happen. A fire must have been there which made it happen. In that case, that distance was subsequently changed, and consequently a relation between the fire and the heated object, which had been non-existent, was produced in time. So you have something sitting there, a fire was far away, then the fire came close and heated it up, and then the fire moved away, or whatever, right? Similarly, we shall find that the causes of everything that within that which exists is produced in time is the mixture of the elements, right? Which are bodies acting upon one another and acted upon by one another. I mean to say that the cause of the production of that which is produced in time is the nearness of a body to a body, or the remoteness of body to a body. So the bottom line from all of this is that any a shape or any tsura that's being that caused has to have been caused by something else, and if it, as once when it gets close to it, it can make it happen. When it's too far, it won't make it happen. Okay, that's the idea. I'm sorry, we gotta plug through this in order to understand the points he's going to try to make, because he's aiming soon at the idea of, this is a very it's a Maimonidean idea which uses Aristotelian physics to explain how God influences this world, and it's the idea of overflow. I'm kind of giving it away, but that's where he's getting towards, right? As for the things produced in time that we find that are not consequent upon the mixture of the elements, namely all the forms, remember, chomer, right, substance, refers to the four elements: earth, air, water, fire. Tsura, that which makes those substance have a certain quality to it, right? That is a that tsura is something that it gives the chomer its form, right? So the things that are not consequent to picture element, meaning all of the forms, right? So in other words, we're not talking about the elements now, but we're talking about the tsura, right? The form, right? They also must indubitably have an agent. I mean, the giver of the form, which giver is not a body. So in other words, who makes, so if you're thinking in this hylomorphic way, so you have the elements, and something makes those elements form together to become a cat. I just, a cat walks across someone's screen, right? So what made all of those elements get together and form a cat? Something must be doing that. I think we all have cats. I think that's just the thing today. But anyway, so that there must be some form, and that is not a body, right? That is a form. So some form must have given that form, and so on and so forth, all the way back up to God, who gave all the forms form, right? So this can also be made clear to you through the fact that every mixture of elements is capable of receiving an increase and a decrease and is produced gradually, whereas the forms are not like this. They're not produced gradually. Accordingly, there's no motion in them. The form that gives matter its form, right? They don't do anything. It's the matter that moves. It's not the form that moves. They invariably are produced or passed away in no time. Accordingly, they do not come about through the action of the mixture, but the mixture only prepares matter for the reception of the form. Whereas the agent that produces the form is a thing that is not capable of being divided. For that which is so the matter you can cut into pieces, right? If you have a house, you can take the bricks out, but that which gives the form to the bricks is just, it's an essence which can't be changed, which can't be broken in half. Hence, it is clear that the agent that produces the form, I mean to say its giver, must of necessity be a form, namely one that is separate. Um, so I made a note to myself. There's this concept. So remember, the concept of Homer and Tzura, matter and form. Matter, right, is something, right, which we're looking at, and the form is some essence. We would look at it as almost some kind of a spiritual essence. The Rambam is looking at it as a concept in physics. It's some kind of energy or some kind of force that makes this matter have a certain shape to it and certain qualities to it. So that is not affected by a relationship to something else, right? Matter, the table can only be made by a carpenter who's standing next to the table, or a machine that the carpenter made that's standing next to the table, right? But the essence of the table has something made that tzura, something made that essence, but that something doesn't have to be in the table. It could be somewhere else, but it somehow flows to it, right? There's some kind of a force that flows to it, right? Now, it is absurd that any preference recorded by this agent without a body should be due to a certain relation, right? It's not because it's near it. It's not because it's next to it, right? So you have a fire making a rock hot, they have to be near each other. But the essence, the thing that makes fire fire, and the things that makes rocks rocks, that does not have to be next to it. For it is not a body, and accordingly cannot draw near or recede, or have a body draw near or recede from it. Think about what Rambam is, he's laying down the foundation for the idea that God, who is not a body, right, can give form, can make the whole world be what it is without having any spatial relationship to that thing, right? God doesn't have to be next to me, right? So the idea of a spatial relationship with God, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself because I want you to understand why he has to go through all this. Otherwise, it can get kind of boring. But he's trying to say, because God is not a body, God is giving form to everything that exists in this world, but there's no spatial relationship. He doesn't have to be next to you to make it happen, right? Because that's just not how it works. Accordingly, the cause of the non-existence of a particular action is the non-existence of the preparation of the particular matter. What happens? Why would it be that if the table that I'm looking at isn't all of a sudden becoming a chair, right? Right? It's because the table is not ready to accept the form of a chair, right? Whatever force it is that makes tables and chairs, right? The table is not ready to accept that. The mud that's sitting outside in my backyard after a rain or some whatever might not be ready to become a house, right? But when the matter is ready to accept it, it will accept that form. So accordingly, now I'm at the top of page 279. Accordingly, it has become clear, and he's getting closer and closer to describing how God interacts with this world. What's fascinating here is he's explaining it by using Aristotelian physics, right? He's using physics to describe how this works, which is, as we read through it, try to think of what we can take from this. Accordingly, it has become clear that the action of bodies upon one another in respect of their forms necessitates the preparation of the various kinds of matter with a view to the reception of the act of that which is not a body, these acts being the forms. I explained this outside a couple times already, right? So the matter needs to be ready to accept the form, considering that the effects produced by the separate intellect, right, are clear and manifest in that which exists, right? Being everything that is produced anew, but does not result solely from the mixture of elements itself. It is necessarily known that this agent, and I'm going to explain this in my own words in a minute, that this agent does not act either through immediate contact or at some particular distance, for it is not a body, right? So the separate intellect, right, which is the spiritual forces, right, which remember these the intellects that exist in the spheres that go around the world. Hence the action of, so they affect the world, right? Not because they're next to us and not because they're physically close and they go and they take their hands and they make something happen, but there's some sort of a flow that goes from the upper spheres and flows into the world below us. Hence, the action of the separate intellect is always designated as an overflow, not because it really means a flow, but because it's not something that's actually flowing, but it's the best comparison that we can give to make it make sense to us. Being likened to a source of water that overflows in all directions and does not have one particular direction from which it draws while giving its bounty to others. So here Rambam is talking about um, the vision, the idea. If you imagine you're standing next to a spring that's bubbling out of the ground, the water just flows in whichever direction it goes. It can go in all directions, right? Whichever, it'll just flow everywhere, right? So for it springs forth from all directions and constantly irrigates all the directions nearby and afar. So it doesn't have to be close. I'm almost 100% certain that Rambam has in mind, and I didn't have a minute to prepare, so give me 1 minute and I'll tell you where the chapter in Ezekiel. I forget which one it is. Um, it's Ezekiel 47, right? I'm going to read it to you for a second because it's the Rambam is he doesn't actually quote it, but it's almost impossible to imagine that he didn't have this in mind when he wrote this. So give me 1 second. Um, So it's a vision of the Bayit Shlishi, of the third Beit, the third temple, the one that's going to be built in the future. And Ezekiel gives the following vision: Vayishiveni el Pesach habayis. He, meaning this angel who is showing Ezekiel, Yechezkel, these visions of the future temple. He brought me to the opening the door of the temple. V'hinei mayim yotzim. There's water coming out mitachat miftan habayit kadima. That's coming out of the platform of the temple on the east side. Kipnei habayit kadim, because the house was facing the east. V'hamayim yardim, and the water was coming out from under. And he goes, I'm going to skip a little bit. Then he took me to the north. All right, and he shows me water coming out from the no, he took me to the north, and then he was able to, and he saw it there, and then he took me and saw water coming from the south, under the south wall. And then he went and he measured out, and it goes on where he measured here, and as he went out from the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the water was getting higher and higher and higher in depth. It's worth looking at the chapter. It's beautiful, and the idea at the end is this beautiful vision that every living creature on the planet, right, wherever the flow from the water from the temple would come and give them sustenance, and there was fish and plants and trees growing, and it was healing waters all around the world. So this vision, this idea of water coming from all different directions, coming from the temple and pouring forth to the entire world. I can't even imagine that Rambam wasn't thinking this when he was writing these words, because it's a powerful vision of the future where it becomes obvious that the sustenance that comes from Jerusalem is something that's a bounty that spreads to the entire world, and all of nature, all of the creatures of the world, even the fish of the sea, the trees, and all of humanity, and every being benefits from this water. So the reason why it uses water, Rambam says, is because that's how we understand this shefa, this overflow that comes from the spheres above us, that comes from these intellects. Similarly, the intellect in question may not be reached by a force coming from a certain direction and a certain distance, nor does the force of that intellect reach out. So the water can flow 100 miles away, and the source of the water isn't there. It's very far away. but it's still giving sustenance, giving something to that thing which is very far away. For its action is constant as long as something has been prepared. All you need to be at the end is be a tree that has roots that can suck the water up. Be something that can use that sustenance, that can use that water. Similarly, with regard to the Creator, this is similar to how, and this is this is where he was leading us up to. This is the same thing with God. May His name be sublime. Inasmuch as it has been demonstrated that He is not a body, right, and had been established that the universe is an act of His, and that He is its efficient cause, that God created the world, as we have explained and shall explain. I've been saying that until now, but I'm going to say it in even more depth soon, right? It has been said that the world derives from the overflow of God. And the term comes up several times in Tanakh, the idea of the shefa, of the overflow, right? And that this is how God relates to the world, that He has caused to overflow to it everything in it that is produced in time. So this non-spatial relationship is an overflow from God, similar to the only way we can, a way we can try to imagine it is by using this water analogy and using the term flow, which Rambam has emphasized a million times until now, that it's not actually that, but it's the closest we can come in our own minds, in our own human minds and we are spatially restricted, right? We are dimensionally restricted. We can only think in dimensions, right? In the same way, it is said that He has caused His knowledge to overflow to the prophets. And here's the basis of something he's touched on a little. He's touching on a little now, and like he always does, he drops little things, and eventually he's going to say it in more detail. But this is what the prophets tap into, right? When a prophet understands God's wisdom, God allows His wisdom to flow through the world, through these spheres, through these intellects, and these intellects they enter our minds. And if you're a prophet, you can tap into that flow, and you can understand the mind of God this way. In the same way, it is the meaning of all this is that these actions are the action of one who is not a body, right? There is no actual body, but there is a source, and we can imagine it as a spring of flowing water, right? And that spring was beautifully described by Yechezkel, who described the time in the future when the whole world will benefit from this spring of knowledge. And it is his action that is called overflow. This term, I mean overflow, is sometimes also applied in Hebrew to God, may He be exalted, with the view to likening Him to an overflowing spring of water, as we have mentioned. For nothing is more fitting as a simile to the action of one that is separate from matter than this expression. It's deliberately choosing this because the source it's not something that you can describe as a being, as a matter. I mean overflow. We are not capable of finding the true reality of a term that would correspond to the true reality of the notion, right? We can't actually describe how God relates to us, but this is something that we can try to use as some way of trying to understand it. For the mental representation of the action of one who is separate from matter is very difficult. We can't understand. We know, the Rambam is saying that we know that the physics of this happens, right? We know, remember, in Aristotelian physics, we know that those spheres that are rotating have intellects in them, and those intellects are affecting the way matter happens on this world, right? We know that happens scientifically, right? But we can't understand it. We can't comprehend it. So God's the same way, right? For just as the imagination cannot represent itself as existent other than a body or first body, we can't imagine things that are not bodies. We just can't, because we are bodies. So that's the only thing our brains are capable of thinking of. The imagination also cannot represent itself in action taking place otherwise than through the immediate contact that we can. If we want to affect something, if I'm standing here at the table, I can bang the table and make a noise. I can't imagine how to bang this table if I'm standing 100 feet away from it. It's just not something we can conceive of, right? But using this analogy, we can try to get close to some sort of a conception. Accordingly, when it was established as true among some belonging to the multitude that the deity is not a body, or that He does not draw near to that which He does, so, and then now he's going to the mistakes that some people make. So now once I do describe to someone, right, and I tell them God is not a body, so then they think to themselves, well, if God is not a body, right, then how does he make things happen on this world, right? the only person that this table could move is if I come and push it. An animal comes and pushes it, but something has to push it, right? What makes it move, right? So they said, oh, well, God must work through angels, right? He must tell somebody, hey, you go down there and you push it, right? So, and Rambam is saying this is a huge mistake, right? That's not how it works. God doesn't need bodies to make it work, because when you look at this overflow concept, that's not a spatial issue. It's not something when non-bodies make things happen, right? That doesn't work that way. It works through some way that you and I can't conceive, right? So they understood, and so they imagined that he gives commands to angels and they accomplish actions through immediate contact. So God tells the angel, hey, Joe, angel, you go down there and push the table around, right? And the drawing near of one body to another, as we do with regard to what we act upon. They also imagined that the angels were bodies, and then they thought that the angels are actual creatures that do actual things, right? Remember, Rambam said the angels are the intellects. The angels are things that we can't conceive of. They're not actual things doing actual stuff in the terms of bodies, in terms of dimensional beings. They're things that act in this spiritual way that we can't even conceive. Some of them believe that he may be exalted, gives a command to a particular thing by means of speech similar to our speech. I mean, through the instrumentality of letters and sounds, and that in consequence, that thing is affected. All of this follows imagination. Now, Rambam is hinting here towards a concept which he's going to also talk about more later, but he also hinted a little bit before, and that is the idea that there's two types of thinking. And this is similar to many psychological theories today. But the Rambam's idea is there's thinking, there's reason, and there's imagination. There's logic is a part of our brain, and then there's the part of our brain which we would more associate with more artistic kind of thinking. But it's where we imagine things, and we could dream of things, and sometimes we can even imagine or dream of things that aren't necessarily logically consistent. The Rambam will say this later, but I'm going to throw this out now, that the greatness of a prophet is that he's able to synthesize his imaginatory faculties and his logic. So, for example, the best example given is, let's say, Isaiah, right? So Isaiah said a very famous statement once, right? They shall beat their swords into plowshares, right? That's an imaginary thing, right? Imagining people beating swords into plowshares is an image that we can imagine, we can dream of, right? But there's also a thought and a logic, right? He's thinking of a concept. He's saying we need to strive towards world peace, right? So he wants us to think about making peace, right? So he uses his logic and fuses it with his imagination to present to us a beautiful prophecy, a picture that's indelible, something that's solid. So that's where, but however, if you're not a prophet, or if you're not even close to being a prophet, and your imagination starts going wild and you start imagining that God has to do things the way we do things and so on, then you start making very big mistakes, which is in also the true reality, the evil impulse. So here the Rambam is saying is that this mistake of thinking that God has to act the same way that we act, and constantly trying to peg God into physical things, right? And constantly trying to say that angels are real beings and God has to work that way, is the source of people's of the evil impulses, the source of people making mistakes. And this is a really powerful thing that he doesn't go into deeply here. But let me read the last sentence of this paragraph. For every deficiency of reason or character is due to the action of the imagination. When we don't control our imaginations and we allow it to run wild, or consequent upon its action, right? That what happens is you have a deficiency of reason, and when you lose reason, you start making very big mistakes. Now, and it's not would not be wrong for me to say over here that when people make an assertion that's completely contrary to reason, right? What the Rambam is saying over here, for example, and this is clearly his meaning, and we'll see this repeatedly, and we've seen it already several times, and he's consistent in his halachic works as well. That if somebody says, for example, that you should put on tefillin, right, or put a mezuzah on your house, because God uses those things as a means to affect our lives, right? God uses that mezuzah to guard over your house, right? That is exactly what the Rambam just said is the evil impulse. Now pack that up and take it and accept it in your heart. Okay. I know some people might go apoplectic and go bonkers when I say something like that, because there's many people with long beards that will tell you just that. But the Rambam is so adamantly against that concept that you cannot claim that God uses physical objects in order to make differences in our lives. That's just not how it works, right? If I make this magical challah and that's going to make me rich, because that's not how God works. It just does not work that way. And that is, according to the Rambam, the evil impulse. He says it black on white so many times, but there's still so many people out there that think he didn't say it for reasons which you can try to imagine on your own. However, how does God work? He works in a way that we can't understand, but we're using this analogy so that we can at least have something to, as long as we realize that the analogy is just that, it's an analogy, but as he emphasized numerous times that we can't actually understand how it works, then we're okay, right? Then we're fine. Now, this, however, is not the object of this chapter. I went off the program here, Rambam says, for its purpose is to understand the notion of overflow. The bottom line is, I'm trying to get you to understand what this idea of overflow is. What do I mean when I say that there's an overflow? I mean that God, through ways which we can't understand, but let's just use the analogy of water flowing, flows from the source to all the intellects that are in the spheres, and that then flows from those spheres into this world, and that's what gives this world that makes all of the elements in this world form into everything that we see, all the objects that we see, the life that we see, the human beings, the animals, the plants, everything is a result of that overflow, which causes the elements to assemble themselves and deassemble themselves when people die, and so on, and so on and so forth. I mean to say the angels, because of that, right? With regard to body's intellect, I mean to say the angels. And he emphasizes again that angels are not actual things. They are these not things that we can conceive of, but they're these intellects that are just receiving overflow and then giving overflow. Right? It is also said with regard to the portions of the spheres that they overflow towards that which exists. Thus, the overflow of a sphere is spoken of, though its actions proceed from a body. Now, the sphere itself is a body, in Aristotelian thing. So the sphere itself is rotating and moving stuff around, right? Hence the stars act at some particular distances, right? And remember, Rambam used the example of the moon, which he viewed as the lowest of the stars and the lowest of the spheres, acts upon water, which he sees with their own eyes, right? From there, astrology comes in. This is what, this is how the stars act on things on this earth. Now, it's important. Rambam is going to talk about astrology in the sense that astrology influencing our lives later on, and he's going to debunk it, right? He's going to say that it's all a bunch of baloney. However, the physical aspect of the moon making things happen on this world, and the rotation of the stars making things happen on this world, and the sun making that, the Rambam is saying, is very real, right? That kind of astrology is very real. As for our remark that the books of the prophets likewise apply figuratively the notion of the overflow to the action of the deity, right? A case in point is the dictum, they have forsaken me, the fountain of Be'er Mayim Chaim, right? The fountain of living waters, which refers to the overflow of life, that is, of being, which is life without any doubt. And he's bringing other examples, for with thee is the fountain of life, right? It signifies the overflow of being. In the same way, the remaining portion of this verse, in thy light do we see light, has a self-same meaning, right? That through the overflow of the intellect, that overflow from thee, we intellectually cognize and constantly receive correct guidance. We draw inferences and apprehend the intellect. All right. So this is when it says we see light in your light, that's because our intellects, the form that's within us as human beings, is tapping into this overflow, right? That comes from God initially, and we're able to therefore understand and think. And that's how the power of our intellects works. Understand this. So this is a pretty deep chapter, and there's a lot to think about. And I'm going to open the floor now. Before we get on, I'm just going to give you a little hint. The next one, he's going to go head on into his arguments for the non-eternity of the world being created in time. The big before I open the floor, I want to tell you how. So the Rambam is explaining this based on Aristotelian physics. What do we do with this today, right? This idea of overflow. This is a question that a lot of modern Maimonidean scholars discuss. Like, should we just skip these chapters because they're all based on this, or should we read it and then somehow apply our modern knowledge using these similar ideas? But I'll leave that open if you guys have any thoughts. All right, I'm opening the floor now. Go ahead.
Okay, Rob, Shaul.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure why angels have to be like just basically a spiritual thing. Not, I mean, the like when the parents of Shimshon are told, or when the mother sees I presume it's an angel, and maybe that's not correct, but I think she perceives a physical person, doesn't she?
Well, I'm glad you brought that. It's a very good question slash point, because Rambam consistently explains those types of revelations as visions, right? The
Okay.
Maimonidean Mefarshim, such as Radak to a large degree, and Ralbag Gersonides to an even larger degree, they'll explain all of those things as visions, right? As, in other words, there was no actual being standing, or Rambam famously says this about the three angels that visited Avram Avinu, to give him the news of the birth of Yitzchak, right? That was a vision, right? There was no actual angels there. Avram Avinu, because he's a prophet, his imaginatory faculty and his intellectual faculty was capable of he was capable of those images which we tend to associate with our imagination, right? He was able to control those images and manipulate those images so that he was seeing the logical thoughts that he was perceiving from this overflow from God. So Avram Avinu, and in the case of the parents of Shimshon, that they were seeing the same thing, right? What they were seeing was a vision, which was like an artistic representation of the wisdom that they were receiving from God. So they were able to put it into an image of a person or an angel speaking and talking to them, even while there was no actual. If you and I were standing there looking at them while they were having this vision, we probably would have seen a couple of people meditating, right?
Hmm.
And that's how a lot of other Mefarshim go to town. And how could Rambam say that it was just a vision? But the Rambam is very consistent with that. That this is what prophecy is. These are visions. They're not things that actually happen. And I'm glad you brought it up, because it's important to make that clear. That's how he understands prophecy. That's how he understands all of these happenings.
So any encounter in the Torah is between an angel and a human is simply a manifestation of the individual's own mind. Is that
Exactly.
correct?
Exactly true. That's exactly true. Yes. and
Okay.
and that's how, yeah, that's how Rambam explained a lot of uh difficult to explain parts of the Torah become easier to explain when it's a vision. One famous case, which I kind of I was a little bothered by this, is the case of the Navi Hosea, right? Hosea, right? The Navi Hosea was famous. If you haven't read the book, it's worth it. It's the first of the 12 minor prophets. Hosea, it's a beautiful book, but it starts with a very striking instruction by God. God tells Hosea to go marry a prostitute,
Oh,
right? And he goes and he marries the prostitute, and she cheats on him. It's a very, very highly charged sexual drama which goes on in this book. But it's extremely difficult to somebody like, how is, like, what's going on over here, like, God is telling him to marry a prostitute. Like, well, what is this? It just doesn't make sense. I mean, I actually, if you read it and you imagine it actually happening, it becomes it's a very powerful story because there's a lesson to be learned, and I can give away a little bit if you want me to, but I would recommend that you go to my podcast, Let the Prophet Speak, and listen to my lectures on Hosea. Um, but that aside, the Radak and others that are Maimonideans explain the whole thing as a vision. So that once you say it's a vision, then it's easy, right? Hosea he was a prophet and he had this vision of God, then you don't have to get into all the thorny problems of God commanding him to have this very unusual marriage for the Bible, So but that's the classic example. But it happens many times where those that follow Rambam's lead explain things as visions. I mean, you can like it or not like it, but that's how the Maimonideans explain it. I happen to like Hosea better, imagining it as real, but whatever, take what you want.
Okay, I'll look into it.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments?
Yeah, I have a kind of a question. I can visualize overflow of water getting to the roots of a tree and how that helps the tree strengthen, grow, all of that. I'm really trying to bring this into, like, how does that manifest in human life? Like, how is the analogy? How does it play out?
So if we imagine things, it's important to always go back to the basic Aristotelian physics, right? And the way he looked at things is that there's only 4 elements in his physics, right? Earth, air, water, fire, right? And you mix them all together, and let's say you mixed it all together and you made a golem, right? So you have a form of a human being now made of a nice big mix of earth, air, water, fire, however you did it, right? You baked it up so that it's nice and solid. That's how you got the fire in there. And you put the mud and the water and exactly. And if you're looking at the golem, he's lying on your exam table or your laboratory table, your Frankenstein or whatever. And now what? It's just sitting there. It's not doing nothing, right? So there is this. That's chomer, right? That's form. I'm sorry. That's matter. I made a mistake. That's matter, right? The form is the other thing. Form is this quality in physics which they couldn't describe. You and I would probably describe it as some mixture of energy and forces or something like that, but we can't really describe it in modern terms because we think of things so differently than they did. But Aristotle would say there's some sort of a force, right, which comes from some other force up above, right, that's flowing down, that turns all this matter and says you're going to be a human being now. And then that golem gets up and starts walking around the room and eats lunch with you, right? So that's how they viewed every single thing in the world, right? They viewed it as this. There's this substance, and then the substance would be just a blank nothing if not for some form that comes into the substance and gives it. So therefore so what Rambam is saying then is that the ultimate giver, so you have this form that makes that golem into a person walking around, right? There's some other force up there, right? There's an intellect right up there that gives that flows towards that human being and makes the human being a human being. And then there's an intellect above that intellect that flows towards that intellect, right? And makes that intellect into whatever it is that's making the spheres move, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the ultimate intellect, right? The ultimate intellect with a capital I, which would be God, right? And remember his analogy we said last week of where it's like you can have a person who's wealthy because he has enough to eat and drink on his own. He has a house, he has car, he has what he needs, but that's it. But then you can have a wealthy guy who's so wealthy that he has a house and a car, but he also has money which he can use to give everybody else in town, and he can donate to the poor and everything. And that's how these intellects are. They get sustenance from above. They get this form, or right, this flow from above, but they have so much of it that they flow to that, they give more to the next and gives more to the next until it lands in the world where we are. So 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 it all makes sense because you have to go back to Aristotelian physics to make it make sense, right? It's not a language that we would use. So this, I'm gonna, there's a podcast that I might have mentioned that I've been listening to called Judaism Demystified. I like the guys in the podcast, and they do a really good job. They have a lot of really great things. But the guy that runs the podcast promised me that he's having somebody on soon who's going to talk exactly about this topic, right? Of what do we do with the Rambam's explanation of overflow when we don't have Aristotelian physics? How do we deal with it, right? Do we chuck it in the garbage can and say, let's just skip those chapters? Or is there some way we can apply it to our modern way of thinking? And I don't have a good answer to that question now, but I am putting it out there that I think it's personally, I feel it's worthwhile learning because I do find it to be meaningful to me, even though Aristotelian physics doesn't work anymore. And as we build his logic more and more, and everything builds on everything else, we're going to start saying, yeah, fine. Aristotelian physics doesn't work. But what he's saying is teaching me how to use the science that I know, the knowledge that I know, right? And how do I try to apply that to a world in which I believe that there's a God and a creator that runs all of this. And that I think is very relevant to us today, because we can use the science, we can use the physics, and now how does God go into this mix? So if the overflow is this overflow of something that we can't really describe, of Aristotelian form, tsura, which is the Hebrew word, right? But maybe the overflow, now we could understand it in a different way. There's energy, there's forces that interact between celestial bodies that are bazillions of miles away, right? I mean, the galaxies have forces that operate upon each other from gazillion, I don't know how many miles, right, how distant they are, but in absurdly crazy distances that we can't even imagine, and they're still having force, gravitational forces and all kinds of forces upon each other, right? So we can imagine God working in a similar way. Remember, we can never really imagine God. It's never, Rambam always throws in the caveat, remember, don't think you actually understand how God does it, but we can use these analogies of these forces that act from so far, right? So nowadays we can call it a force. We can call it an energy. So I'm kind of keeping my promise right now and saying that I'm going to try to apply it today. This is kind of the way I like to look at it, and say that, yeah, so God is not spatial. He's not someone who we can describe, but just like a galaxy can work, so if you don't use the word flow, you use the word, I don't know, gravitational pull, right? But it's the same kind of thing of God acting in a way that's not spatially related. He doesn't have to be next to me to be doing something to me. All right.
So
Anyway,
let me ask you this, as far as from the philosophy that they were kind of operating under. There's obviously there's a tree that's alive, and then there's a table that is no longer alive. It sounds like from this he's talking about life, like life is being flowed, but forces can move inanimate objects, can move objects that are no longer alive. Or maybe there just needs to be a better definition of life.
You're saying a really good point, but I want to say something, that they looked at this differently in those days. They understood that there's four categories of beings. There's a domem, which is something that is just not, it just sits, a rock, right? And then there's a tzomeach, which is a plant that sprouts. And then there's an animal, and then there's a human. Those are the four levels of beings. And they looked at, there's something making a rock being a rock, just like there's something making a tree being a tree, right? Something assembled the elements together and said, be a rock, right? So that the rock took a form of a rock and acts like a rock and walks like a rock and talks like a rock, right? So they actually they did understand that the rock doesn't have what they would have called a soul, like a life, what you and I would say. But they did still think that there was still some form of tsura making that be a rock. Otherwise, why isn't it just go poof and all the dust just go all over, right? But there's something making that gives that form too. So it's not really what you and I would call life, because the Homer, right, is make the Tzura is making my table a table, and my table's not alive, right? But something is giving my table the form of a table, that it should have these qualities. It should be hard. It should be what, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Sounds
So
very
again,
Aristotelian.
yeah, it is very Aristotelian,
Yeah.
and that's how
The
that's
table.
how they thought of the world, right?
Interesting. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem. Any other comments before we close up shop for the week? Well, if there, you can always text me if you have comments, and many of you do. And next chapter, we're going to head on to the one place where Rambam and Aristotle went head to head, and it's going to be fascinating, because it's where the religious man comes in and says, "Okay, all this science is good, but now where's my creator? Like, I need to have my religion." So, and the Rambam's going to take on that argument, and we'll see what he does with it. So. Everyone have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for joining tonight. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.